Guys, what if the matrix was a matrix? Then you could manipulate it and break free like Daddy Tate tells us and end up fulfilling your actual purpose. Fuck school and university, you could finally start that dropshipping store and jack up the prices of things that don't need to be jacked up. Right? So think about it. What does the math matrix represent? Right? You might have heard that it's just a thing that contains a bunch of numbers and for some reason we make it have sex with random vectors. And then that gives some other random vector as a child. But that's some bullshit. Look, each matrix represents a transformation. What are we transforming? Vectors. All the vectors in any given space. But then you can be like, what are those numbers? Well, the columns of a matrix represent the transformed versions of these two vectors right here. So this transformation takes the green vector up to 0, 1. So that's why the first column is 0, 1. And then it takes the yellow vector down to 1, 0. So the second column is 1, 0. See, that's a whole new way of looking at matrices, right? Now, why are we only considering the transformation of these two vectors right here? Is it racism? Nah, bro, it's sexism. Come on, go with the trend. Just kidding. It's because these vectors are actually special needs. They're called basis vectors. And all that means is that using these two vectors, you can raw dog the entire 2D plane. Like you can get to any point using these two vectors because you can form any other vector by scaling and adding these two vectors. And a vector is just a dig that points towards a point. So then you can get to any point as well. Now, in math terms, we call raw dogging the entire plane spanning the plane. I don't know why they wouldn't accept the former term. They had like a jury sit on it and whatever, it didn't go through. So the vectors span two-dimensional space. Now, another criteria for being a basis vector is that the vectors must also be linearly independent, which is to say you cannot get one just by adding and scaling the other one. Okay, now let's go to the Andrew Tate matrix. Now, what does Daddy Tate say that the matrix does, right? It transforms this life that you could have had and caps your potential. So what are we saying mathematically? That this op matrix transforms vectors in your life and takes them to 0. Now, the next question is, how can you even represent your life in vectors? Well, think about the 3 things that are important, right? Like health, wealth, and relationships. So let's put each of them on an axis. Now, if you're in decent shape, your vector in the health direction would be here. If you have, average earnings, your earnings vector would be here. And if you have healthy relationships, you don't fuck your cousin, that vector would be here. Now, if you combine these to get a vector in 3 dimensions, you could be at this point represented by this vector here. But if you weren't being held down by the matrix, you could go crazy. You could make millions if you weren't being held down by school and university, right? If only you could go to Hustlers University and pay a sex trafficker like $40 a month. Dream scenario, bro. So the vector on the wealth axis would be massive, like 0, 0, 100. Same for your relationship vector. You could have 8 wives. If one of them decides to do OnlyFans, you get an 80% cut of it, bro. Obviously, it's your product. So this vector should be 0, 8, 0 because it's only related to relationships, right? The health vector, you would still be a fat incel without the matrix. So this would be like 1, 0, 0. But it's okay, 2 out of 3. Now note that these vectors are all basis vectors in the same way that these 2 vectors in 2 dimensions were also basis vectors, right? They were all linearly independent. And you can combine and scale these 3 vectors to get to any other vector in 3-dimensional space. So your overall life vector without the matrix can be represented by this vector here by combining all your basis vectors. But now the matrix transforms this vector and takes it all the way back to 0 and caps your potential. Now when shit starts going to 0, we bring the null space in. So every transformation has a null space attached to it. And the null space is the dimension of the space that's being sent to 0. Here the space is 2-dimensional. Why? Because you have 2 linearly independent vectors being sent to 0. And 2 linearly independent vectors can span at most a 2-dimensional space. Right? So because these 2 vectors are going to 0, this 2-dimensional space is as well. But remember, our original goal was to find the matrix mathematically that does the job of the actual matrix, which transforms this 2-dimensional space in your life to 0. So remember how the columns of any matrix are the transformed versions of the basis vectors? Well, the vector on the wealth axis is the 3rd basis vector, and that gets mapped to 0. So the 3rd column of the matrix will be 0. Same with the 2nd column, right? It also gets transformed to 0, 0, 0. But this last column, your health column, stays at 1, 0, 0, right? Because you're still a fat incel with or without the matrix. So boom, that's the final matrix. We found the op.